Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat Saeed Khan. I am a journalist based here in New York City, covering the latest from Pakistan and the rest of South Asia. It's been 2 weeks since the most consequential election in Pakistan's recent history. Consequential because the elections have been considered the most rigged, consequential because they've been considered the most polarizing, consequential because they've triggered possibly the biggest crackdown, human rights wise, internet access wise, freedom of assembly wise, in Pakistan's living memory. And yet, Washington and its partners in other Western capitals are mostly quiet. I say mostly because there are only the most timid of noises made in daily State Department and White House briefings, where the spokespersons say things like internal matter and we hope the Pakistanis investigate this or that. And we are watching this closely. And yet, it's business as usual in Pakistan, where the world's fifth largest military keeps on running past interference in the country's constitutional system. It does this through daily abductions and arrests. Just last night, one of the country's most popular journalists was picked up in the middle of the night, only a few months after he was released, just 4 months after 4 months of illegal incarceration and torture. It does this through regular internet and social media blackouts. Twitter has now been shut down in Pakistan for the sixth day running, and the whole country's internet was shut down at least 3 times in the run-up to the election. And it does this through puppeteering a coalition of its hand-picked politicians who lost the recent elections, and installing them in office. And of course, it does this through the continued incarceration of the country's most popular leader, Imran Khan. So what's happening here? What's Washington not getting or pretending not to get about Pakistan's crackdown? What can Pakistani Americans, Pakistanis, and even concerned global citizens do to convince the West to intervene? And if not intervene, then at least drop its double standards, where it can punish the dictatorships and governments in Russia, in Venezuela, in Iran for similar actions, but not the generals in Pakistan. So to get a handle on this question, we have a Washington insider on my show tonight. Welcome to the show, Erik Sperling. You are the executive director of Just Foreign Policy, which is an advocacy organization that works on U.S. foreign policy. And you have in the past been an advisor in council to Representative Ro Khanna, Representative John Conyers, and even the House Foreign Relations Committee. So firstly, welcome to the show. And I'm going to just jump right back into this, man. You've heard the intro. What am I missing here about Washington? What's Washington not getting here? I can't hear you, Erik. I've lost your audio.
Sorry. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Sure. It's been for you like it's been for, I'm sure, much of Pakistan, which is an incredibly intense few weeks. And we've been really focusing on this. And I think it is, on the upside, it is probably the most attention that Pakistan has got in Washington in, potentially ever, or at least with regards to its politics and its democracy. Certainly Washington gives a lot of attention to, what it calls kind of counter terror type things. But yeah, I think there's a couple dynamics at play. First of all, there's sort of a split. I mean, you have the folks at, say, the State Department who are very much engaged on Pakistan issues. They certainly care a lot about it, and they're very involved. I think Pakistanis know the extent of their involvement very well. But then you have Congress, and the vast majority of staffers or members of Congress have barely thought about Pakistan in their lives, really. I mean, they've heard about it. They know kind of some of the conventional wisdom. So there's a process of kind of education that's taking place. And I think we've seen that with the amount of members of Congress and senators who have started to speak out. Part of that is just because of how appalling the apparent rigging was. It's very hard to ignore it. It's something that's easy for them to understand. I think, American policymakers are familiar with the concept of stealing an election, something they talk about a lot. So this was easy for them to understand in a way that, the more subtle involvement of the U.S. in terms of shaping the politics was not as easy.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's the basic dynamic. And then you have the Pakistani American diaspora that is getting, more influential, and they're learning more about politics, and that's had a huge impact as well. But there's still a long way to go. And I think, over time, that education of those members of Congress, it's only going to increase. I mean, they now have a baseline understanding, and they're going to keep building on that understanding as more things happen, and as the essentially the diaspora brings that information to them and forces them to engage with it.
But I mean, it's a little late in the day for Pakistan to wait for American congressmen to get basically educated about what's been happening there, isn't it? I mean, from a Pakistani perspective, or even from a Pakistani American perspective, the military junta or the military establishment or what have you, pick a name, you can call these guys that, they have enjoyed an old relationship with Washington. DC is familiar with these men. And yet, the dual standard that is being applied in real time to other countries, to the Russians, to the Iranians, to even the Venezuelans, you just pointed out yourself. And it's not necessarily through inside the State Department or Capitol Hill. It's through the IMF. Just a few hours ago, I was watching your Twitter where you mentioned how the IMF has denied funding to Venezuela for its election problems and its government. And yet, you've got literally a similar situation going on where you've got questionable elections, and yet it's Pakistan's internal matter. And the IMF, by the way, seems to be conducting business as usual with the Pakistanis as well. Tell me about this dual standard. Do you see one, or is it just me and my big old bias? What's happening here?
Yeah, no, I mean, anyone who's observing this fairly without any incentive of their own to play into that bias would see it. It's pretty transparent. I think, and Pakistanis are probably the folks who understand it now better than most in the world. But I think especially at the higher levels, whether it's State Department, whether it's obviously intelligence agencies, or even institutions like the IMF that are closely connected to U.S. kind of strategic goals. They, you don't exactly have a sense of how aware that they are, but certainly there's a total bias when it comes to being hypercritical of official U.S. enemies or places where the U.S. sees it as its interest to change the government, and then kind of being more friendly, more kind of toning down their criticism, when they have an interest in a government staying in power. And that's obviously what's taking place in Pakistan. What I will say is that there's a lot of members of Congress who aren't at that high level. There's members of Congress who actually do care about human rights. And they aren't playing some big geostrategic game like the senior people are. And so I think that's our advantage, where, we just talk about the principles that all of us actually care about, sovereignty, democracy, progressive politics. And those members of Congress believe in that. They just don't hear about it as easily because it's not getting covered, not getting that attention from the higher levels. So I'd say that's, I think that's a pretty transparent. And I think, over time, the world starts to see through that. And this is just the latest example where, over time, the criticism coming from State Department, or the lack of it, it will be more and more evident and harder for them to pull that off and get away with it. And I think we're starting to see that, in this case for sure.
Right. I want to build this up towards some sort of positive engagement. I want some sort of solution towards the end of this, especially for Pakistani Americans, because they've been organizing. They've been trying to organize at the very least. They have a long way to go versus the other diasporas which are active here in the US. But before I get to what they can do to make their voices and concerns heard about their country, I'm going to run an anecdote by you. This is not just an anecdote. This actually happened a couple of days back. Shandana Gulzar, who is a woman elected through a popular mandate in a very conservative part of Pakistan. She belongs to the PTI. She was giving an interview to Underground TV. I think they're an independent network. And she essentially said that through her incarceration before the elections, and then during it and after it, she was advised to stop making anti-Western noises. And she was advised to stop giving interviews, much like you're giving, in English to international media. And she was also advised by a member of a Western embassy, she didn't name which one, but who happened to be a friend of hers, to join the other parties, not Imran Khan's PTI, but other parties, and everything will go away. Is that what your read is in DC, that there's a bias against the PTI in particular and Imran Khan in particular? I'm just trying to get the why question. What's Washington's problem with this man called Imran Khan? What exactly do you read as a Washington insider? What am I not getting? Maybe I'm watching the Yankees here in New York and completely out of touch with the rest of the system here. But what's happening inside the Beltway?
Yeah, so it's the same dynamic that I was describing. It happens with a lot of countries where the vast majority of policymakers are pulled many different directions. They don't have the time to specialize and focus on the issue. And so if the State Department, the senior people who are immersed in Pakistan kind of say, hey, this is a U.S. ally, we don't want to be too critical. Most people will say, well, how am I going to know better than the State Department? I better just I don't want to pick a fight with the State Department. That's kind of, if they don't have that information. And certainly the State Department, and I don't think it's any huge secret, they weren't pleased with him on a huge number of fronts. He has a much more independent foreign policy than what they're accustomed to from Pakistan. And at that very key moment when the U.S. was trying to rally the world, including the kind of the global South, as they call it, to oppose, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he was pretty bold in terms of charting out an aggressively neutral, policy on that, which ultimately we ended up seeing was the policy and the approach of the vast majority of the global South. Almost basically everywhere outside of U.S. and Europe, and also Japan and Korea, who are both close U.S. allies, took that position. But at that time, it was very bold and kind of definitely infuriated people. But in general, there's a preference in Washington for leaders who are going to stay in line with U.S. goals, and they're not ready to have an independent Pakistan that they have to kind of treat like you might see, for example, how they're treating Brazil now. That was definitely not, Brazil under Lula is something that they had to get used to. But over time, when it was clear they're not going to just get rid of him by backing, the old methods aren't available to them to kind of, get a more friendly government in place, they have to then grapple with that. And I think Pakistan is on its way to that. And that's what, will happen over time once all these members of Congress, who many of them are more connected to their constituencies, of Pakistani Americans, and over time, they will have that confidence, especially after this election, to start to challenge that, that narrative coming from kind of the senior officials.
Right, but I think the difference between Lula and Khan, if at all, is that Lula was allowed to come back through a free and fair election of some sort, and the Brazilian military isn't quarterbacking those elections and is not is an ally of the U.S., of course, but it's a completely different theater of conflict. But coming back, I'm getting the sense that you're saying this is going to be a slow burn, that eventually the diaspora, Pakistani Americans, Pakistani democracy will come around, and the right people in Washington will get educated enough to see what's going on. Is that what you're saying? Because just right now, headline news in Pakistan is that Senator Chris Van Hollen's, who is or was on the Foreign Relations Committee, he has said effectively the same thing. He's mirrored the same thing Imran Khan said yesterday, which is to connect with the IMF and figure out the rest of the IMF negotiations. And for those people who are not familiar with the importance IMF has in Pakistan's political economy, well, it's second to none. Pakistan is on a slow drip when it comes to on an IV when it comes to being sustained economically by the IMF. So he's saying the same thing which Imran Khan is saying. I see common ground there between a senior US statesman and this man who's been incarcerated for several months now. And yet, we don't see that convert in any way into policy or any sort of policy change, whether it's in the DOS, whether it's at the Pentagon, whether it's at the White House. So, when will that connect happen between senators and congressmen and the administration vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Yeah, well, I could tell you the administration, the state SCA, which is on top of this and focused on this, they would be really unhappy with what Senator Van Hollen just put out. This completely, they never had to contend with this before. So it's still in its earliest stages of people learning about Pakistan, but you can already see that pressure from Congress, it looks like symbolic statements, but when this, like, let's say, for example, that the effort to demand an investigation before the U.S. recognizes the government, let's say that doesn't work. The U.S. decides they're going to recognize the government. Well, reporters are going to say, well, how are you responding to all these senators and Congress members that have said you needed an investigation? And there's going to be pressure there, and they're going to have to come up with a reason. And if it's not a good reason, it's just going to further expose their bad faith on this, and it's going to make it harder next time this happens, but I think our goal right now, and the goal of everyone who supports democracy in Pakistan has to be to continue to increase the pressure now. So folks, so other senators join, Senator Van Hollen, we keep that pressure up. And the State Department is going to, the more pressure we get from Congress, the more they know that people are watching, and the more they have to be cautious in how they respond, because, just what will happen over time is, that pressure will increase. We know that Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S., was speaking last week, and he's talking about restoring military sales and military financing. Well, if the State Department, we happen to know, is also interested in doing that. But, I think they are now becoming keenly aware that that might not be that easy now. That, we're talking about forcing an investigation, but if they want to restore weapons, we're going to have to look at the entire human rights record. So little by little, even if we don't win this initial battle, which I think it is very possible that the pressure continues to build and maybe more revelations come out in Pakistan, and they do have to conduct an audit. But if they don't, State Department is definitely becoming aware that they're not going to be able to just have free reign to do what they want, with Pakistan going forward.
Right. No, that gives me a little bit of hope, though I wish I had more time on the calendar, because it seems like the recognition of this government is going to become a point of contention, which I hope it does, to push the envelope inside the administration. But Erik, last couple of minutes here. I know you're a busy man, but real quickly, we know what you're doing. We know what Just Foreign Policy is doing, which is trying to advocate for a just foreign policy out of the U.S. so that the U.S. keeps clean of situations like Pakistan. That's your job. But what can Pakistanis do, and what can Pakistani Americans in particular do? We've seen them do quite a bit, but frankly, I've been in the U.S. now for 4 years, and I've seen them, with the best of intentions, be rather haphazard. A letter writing campaign to a couple of dozen congressmen, an ad in the New York Times, or a billboard on Times Square. And that's it. I mean, that's about it. And beyond that, nothing from this administration. What can they do to help causes, their own cause, and even a cause like yours?
Yeah, well, I think we got involved in part because we had heard from so many Pakistani Americans that they felt they had done everything that they're supposed to do. They thought, these are folks who really like the idea of America, of democracy. They felt that you just educate the members of Congress, you educate the administration, and they're going to do the right thing once they have the information. And then we got involved because so many were saying, we don't understand. What are we doing wrong? They don't seem to be getting it. And of course, what people are realizing is that there are geopolitical dynamics. It's not just, that they don't understand it. It's kind of what the senior people think they're, is in the U.S. interest, and who the U.S. should be backing to advance U.S. kind of power in the world. And so the counterpoint to that is building a real movement and building your own power separate from that. And I think we've seen that. So, the basic answer is, Pakistani Americans should continue to connect with their members of Congress, continue to get to know them, continue to explain this to them. And over time, you'll want to ensure that members of Congress are committed to not just putting out a symbolic statement or coming to the community meeting, but that they're really charting out for you how they are in this fight with you until Pakistani democracy is restored. And so I think that's what's happening now, is that transition from symbolic statements to make the community happy towards actually really committing to working with the community until democracy, until policy is changed and democracy is restored. And so that's the transition that we need to see. And that's kind of the difference between where the diaspora is now and where groups that really exert pressure. I think some of us know the most famous, groups that exert pressure for bad, which would be like AIPAC. But the same thing can be done to some extent on Pakistan as well over time.
Right. Well, a long way to go before they become something like AIPAC. But we're live, and we've got a bunch of people making all sorts of interesting comments. I've got Fasiha Sheikh, who's saying revolution is the only way. I will take the fifth on that one and let you do two as well. But we've got Nadia 23. She's saying, to your point, she's saying that would take ages. And I think she has a point, because this is a moment of urgency right now. I think maybe one phone call from the right administration official to say, stop it, stop the madness. You're looking at essentially a political economy which is dead in the water. You're looking at the world's fifth largest country, the world's fourth largest democracy, 200 nuclear weapons, 750,000 men at arms. I know there's a lot at stake. You've got 4 borders with some of the most important countries economically or security-wise: Iran, Afghanistan, India, and China. And yet, it seems that the U.S. seems to be following the old playbook: let the generals call the shots. While demographically there's a severe change. You see it, and shutting down Twitter or blocking out the internet is not the solution. That's what the playbook says for the Pakistani military, but that's not what the new 2.0 version of the playbook should be. So do you have any more urgent solutions than educating congressmen, and eventually it'll make its way up to this administration or the next one?
Yeah, well, it's not just educating them. It's about building that independent power. The White House, when they are trying to put in place some foreign policy that's totally unjust and indefensible, they're counting on, that nobody's going to pay attention and they're not going to get any heat for it. Right. So yes, we're educating them, but what we're actually doing is building an independent power center that, where if they hear something from the State Department, well, they have their folks in the community, they're going to go to them, and that is all going to weigh in the State Department's decision-making. And it already is. I mean, they've had to backtrack time and time again, already putting out statements. It's not even close to enough. But the State Department did not want to put out any of those statements. Right. They're doing it because we're the independent power that's being built. And so, I know right now there is a congressional letter that'll be circulating as well this week that, I think now is the time. You could definitely follow us or reach out to us, and we can connect with other Pakistani American groups. And now is the time to build that pressure as high as possible to see if we can stop this thing before they kind of finalize the steal of this election.
All right. Erik Sperling, Executive Director at Just Foreign Policy, which is at JustFP on Twitter/X, and at Erik Sperling on Twitter/X. Thank you for making the time, my friend. And I'm now going to try to real quickly paraphrase all of what you said in Urdu for those of our audiences. So this one you can sit out, but I will hopefully connect with you very, very soon. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for all you're doing.
All right. अब ये एरिक स्पर्लिंग थे, बराह रास्त हमारे साथ इम्पोर्टेंट एडवोकेसी ग्रुप चलाते हैं. बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट ये ग्रुप इसलिए है क्योंकि ये काम करता है वॉशिंगटन के अंदर, वॉशिंगटन में जिधर कैपिटल हिल है उधर काम करता है. अब आपको पता है कि वॉशिंगटन जो है वो GHQ का GHQ है, इसलिए इनसे बात करना जरूरी था क्योंकि हम इधर उधर इर्द गिर्द फिरते रहते हैं कि इमरान ने IMF को लेटर लिखा, अल्टीमेटली वो वॉशिंगटन ही आना है क्योंकि वॉशिंगटन में ही IMF है. हम कहते हैं कि अमेरिका अपना परसों एम्बेसडर मसूद खान जो इधर अमेरिकी एम्बेसडर हैं, पाकिस्तान के एम्बेसडर हैं अमेरिका में, उन्होंने कहा कि चलो जी खोल दो काम, वेपन्स जो हैं, जो हमारी जो फौजी इमदाद है वो फिर से शुरू करो, क्योंकि फौज ने तो अपना जो काम करना था कर लिया, इमरान खान को हटा दिया, अंदर कर दिया, इलेक्शंस करवा दिए। तो अब जो एम्बेसडर साहब हैं वो वही करने लग गए हैं जो उनका काम है, भीख मांगने लग गए हैं कि अच्छा जी जो आपने बोला था हमें काम, वो काम हमने कर दिया है, अब फिर से इमदाद खोल दें और जो भी हैं अपना वेपन्स हैं, हथियार हैं, F-16 है वगैरह, जो भी इनका पाइपलाइन में है वो शुरू हो गया है काम। तो लग ये रहा है कि एक तरफ से जब ट्विटर किसी और मुल्क में बंद होता है तो अमेरिका पागल हो जाता है, जब पाकिस्तान में आज 6 दिन बंद हो गए हैं तो नहीं होता। अच्छा, जब जैसे IMF आज ही IMF ने वेनेजुएला को, जो एक और मुल्क है, उधर भी इलेक्शन हुए हैं, उधर भी गलत इलेक्शन हुए हैं, कहा जा रहा है कि गलत इलेक्शन हुए, वॉशिंगटन में कहा जा रहा है, उधर IMF ने बंद कर दिया है उनका खाता। उनको भी जरूरत है, वो भी एक गरीब मुल्क है। वेनेजुएला का खाता बंद कर दिया, पाकिस्तान का खाता चल रहा है, क्योंकि इनका जो ऑर्डर्स आए थे वो उन ऑर्डर्स की, जो हमारे जर्नलों को जो ऑर्डर्स आए थे उन ऑर्डर्स की तामील हुई है। और अब जो हमारे सफारतकार हैं वो कह रहे हैं कि सर तामील हो गई है, जो आपने कहा था वो हमने कर लिया है काम, अब चलें इमदाद फिर से शुरू करें, IMF भी दें, हथियार भी दें, ताकि फिर से हमारे खाते खुलें और हमारे खांचे खुलें। ये बहुत मैंने पैराफ्रेज किया है, एक लंबी चौड़ी एक जो आप कह सकते हैं जो उनकी डील थी अमेरिका के साथ। मसला ये है कि बीच में एक ये तो अमेरिकी हुकूमत करवा रही है, मगर बीच में इधर भी एक पार्लियामान है, उस पार्लियामान में अलग अलग कांग्रेसमैन है, उस पार्लियामान में अलग अलग सेनेटर हैं। और एरिक स्पर्लिंग जो आए थे, ये एक एडवोकेसी ग्रुप है, ये काम करते हैं अलग अलग लोगों के साथ, अलग अलग ममालिक के साथ, जो कह रहे हैं कि हमारे साथ जो अमेरिका का जो रद्द अमल है, जो अमेरिका की खारजा पॉलिसी है, फॉरेन पॉलिसी है, वो अनफेयर है, वो अनजस्ट है। तो इसलिए इनके ग्रुप का नाम जस्ट फॉरेन पॉलिसी है, मतलब कि एक इंसाफ की फॉरेन पॉलिसी हो। तो ये भी आप कह सकते हैं कि ये एक फॉरेन पॉलिसी की तहरीक इंसाफ चला रहे हैं ये। तो ये एक इम्पोर्टेंट ग्रुप को हेड करते हैं। इनसे मेरी मुलाकात ऐसे हुई कि मैं कुछ अरसे पहले टाइम स्क्वायर पे था, जिधर PTI वालों ने एहतजाज किया था इलेक्शन के 2 दिन बाद। उधर एक जराए से मेरी एरिक स्पर्लिंग से मुलाकात हुई। वो जराए जो थे वो ऑब्वियसली डायस्पोरा का हिस्सा है। तो ये डायस्पोरा इधर कोशिश कर रहा है बेचारा आहिस्ता आहिस्ता कि ऑर्गेनाइज हो, मगर हम देखते हैं कि डायस्पोरा जो इधर ओवरसीज पाकिस्तानीज हैं वो बटे हुए हैं। कोई अभी 1-2 दिन में PTI वाले सैक्रामेंटो में, जो कैलिफोर्निया में एक रियासत का कैपिटल है, कैलिफोर्निया बहुत बड़ी रियासत है, कोई लोग उधर हो रहे हैं, ऑर्गेनाइज कर रहे हैं। अभी कल परसों में इधर एक और सेमिनार हुआ था, वेबिनार हुआ था, अलग अलग चीजें हो रही हैं, मगर एक इकट्ठा, एक आप कह सकते हैं एक ऑर्गेनाइज्ड मुनज़्ज़म किस्म का वॉशिंगटन में कोई प्रेशर बिल्ड नहीं हो रहा। मगर अब नजर आने लग गया है कि इस जैसे एडवोकेसी ग्रुप्स जब इन्वॉल्व हो गए हैं तो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता लोगों को इनकी पार्लियामेंट में, इनकी कांग्रेस में, इनकी सेनेट में पुश किया जा रहा है। अब ये पार्लियामान और सेनेट से जो खतूत लिखे जा रहे हैं, आज एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट बंदे ने, जो इस वक्त dawn.com पे अगर आप जाएं, कल सुबह जब आप डॉन उठाएंगे तो उसकी हेडलाइन होगी, क्रिस वैन हॉलंस ने वही बात की है जो इमरान खान ने की है कि भाई IMF को देखना चाहिए कि ये जो तमाशा लगाया गया है, ये अगर सेटल हो, इन्वेस्टिगेट हो, तो फिर पैसे देने चाहिए। अब इधर जो गोरे हैं वो ये बातें करने लग गए हैं। दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। और एरिक स्पर्लिंग जैसे लोग और दीगर और डायस्पोरा के लोग आहिस्ता आहिस्ता ऑर्गेनाइज कर रहे हैं। पाकिस्तान का डायस्पोरा डिसऑर्गेनाइज्ड है। पाकिस्तानी तो वैसे ही मशहूर हैं डिसऑर्गेनाइज होने में, मगर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता आप कह सकते हैं कि ये एक मूवमेंट इधर बन रही है। और एरिक ने एक इंटरेस्टिंग बात बोली जो बहुत सारे लोगों के पास वक्त नहीं है इस चेंज को लाने का। और बहुत सारे लोग कह रहे हैं, ये भी मैं देख रहा हूँ आप लोगों के, कि अमेरिका को छोड़ो, अमेरिका को छोड़ो। अमेरिका को आप नहीं छोड़ सकते, क्योंकि अमेरिका ने आपको नहीं छोड़ा हुआ। ठीक है, अमेरिका आपकी फौज को इस वक्त इन्फ्लुएंस करता है, कर सकता है और कर रहा है, सालों से, दहाइयों से कर रहा है, और आपकी फौज अल्टीमेटली आपको इन्फ्लुएंस कर रही है। तो आप ये नहीं कह सकते नहीं अमेरिका कभी कुछ नहीं करेगा। मगर एक इंटरेस्टिंग चीज है कि आप मुनज़्ज़म होकर अमेरिका को इन्फ्लुएंस कर सकते हैं। जो आपकी फौज को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहा है और वो फौज जो आपको इन्फ्लुएंस कर रही है, उसको आप भी इन्फ्लुएंस कर सकते हैं मुनज़्ज़म होके, जस्ट फॉरेन पॉलिसी जैसे और दीगर और जो इनिशिएटिव्स हैं उनको फॉलो करके। इसलिए शायद आज हम हार गए हैं, शायद आज पाकिस्तानी जमहूरियत जो है वो खतरे में है। खतरे में क्या, ऑलरेडी उसके साथ जो हुआ है, इमरान अंदर है, चोर डाकू जो हैं, चोर डाकू अलायंस जो है वो मुल्क में, आज पंजाब असेंबली में चोर डाकुओं ने अपना हलफ उठा लिया है, वगैरह वगैरह। ठीक है, مگر دس از اے لانگ وار فار ڈیموکریسی. یہ جمہوریت کے لیے ایک لمبی جنگ ہے, اور اس میں ایک نیا کھلاڑی آیا ہے جس کا میں نے آج آپ ہی کے لیے انٹرویو کیا. ابھی کے لیے نیو یارک سے اتنا ہی. اپنا خیال رکھیں. مجھے آپ لوگ کچھ شاباشی دے رہے ہیں, کسی نے مجھے کرنل وج بنا دیا, ابھی تھوڑی دیر پہلے میں میجر وج تھا. تھینک یو جی, پروموشن آپ نے 1.5-2 منٹ میں میری کر دی, بہت شکریہ. بٹ میں نہ کرنل ہوں نہ میجر ہوں, میں واجی ہوں. اینڈ تھینک یو فار دوز کائنڈ ورڈز. فالو اپ کرتے ہیں تھوڑی دیر بعد ملتے ہیں. شیئر, لائک, سبسکرائب کریں. رائٹ ٹو انفارمیشن جو ہے, صحیح اطلاعات آپ کو پہنچنا آپ کا حق ہے, مگر انڈیپینڈنٹ جرنلزم جو یہ اطلاعات آپ تک پہنچاتا ہے اس کو سپورٹ کرنا آپ کی ذمہ داری ہے. تو آپ فوری طور پہ شیئر, لائک, سبسکرائب اور کامنٹ ضرور کریں, اور اسپیشلی سبسکرائب اور لائک ضرور کریں. ٹیک کیئر. آئی ول سی یو سون. پاکستان زندہ باد.